Okay. You ready? Let's do this. You're listening to Explore Magazine's Live the Adventure podcast. This is the podcast that delves deep into the outdoors, will inspire, inform, and get you stoked to explore. And I'm your host, David Webb. Welcome to part 2 of our chat with adventurer Frank Wolf. I'm David Webb, editor of Explore Magazine. I hope you've had the chance to listen to part 1. Frank and I covered a great deal of topics, including his early days of adventuring to his latest trip, which he writes about in the spring 2019 issue of Explore Magazine. If you've gleaned anything from that interview, it's probably tempered with the fascination of how a normal person can just take the leap into a month-long or longer self-supported expedition across the barren grounds and live to tell about it. So stay tuned as we continue our chat, and Frank will tell us about what he's learned and how you too can step into the world of expedition travel. So what are some of the things you have learned up there from the indigenous people or from the animals or even from the landscape itself that you carry with you after spending so much time in remote areas?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing you do, even though we don't meet a lot of people when we're on these journeys, like for example, the story upcoming, the Singularity was here. We had an amazing interaction. We actually lived for 5 days in Johaven with this Inuit family. And we met them. We kind of changed our plans around. Talk about we basically changed our route because we found out the ice wasn't melting out on this one route we wanted to do, and the water was really low on this river. So we actually decided just to go down the entire back river. But there's no town at the end of the back river, and we basically found out using technology through the InReach. Actually, I texted my wife, and she said she talked to an outfitter up there, and he said that. If you come out to the river, go find this waterfall. We had no idea what this waterfall was, and there might be some Inuit camping there because the ice has just gone out. So just we didn't know where the waterfall was. We just kind of went by feel. We didn't have maps for the last week of our journey, just following the river, as they would have back in the day. We lost even the technology of maps by the end because we didn't have maps for that section of the route. And then we broke out into the Chantry Inlet and just kind of looked around. There's only one kind of high ridge in the distance that looked like there was rock. We thought the only place there could be a waterfall is out there. So we just went towards like 20K, kept going. We thought, oh, this is hopeless. Didn't see anyone out there. And then, sure enough,
and it's going to be too far to paddle to get all the way to town, right?
Yeah, we could have.
Or at least in open water.
It would have been like it's very big. It's very wide open. You get like big, it's a big open crossings, and it's really consistently windy up there. You get kicking, breaking 10-footers, very dangerous to kind of try to cross all the way over King William Island. And so basically we just saw these two little tents popping up, and then we went in there, just rolled in this family, and they were all in bed. I kind of knocked on the first tent, and then the woman in there, she popped it open, and she looks at me and she says "kabluna," like the word for white person. And she goes back in and hear they're talking in Inuktitut, and her husband comes out, this guy.
He must have got a kick out of that.
Jacob, and he's got a big smile on his face. He's really smiley. And then his family was next door. They came out, and we just hung out with them, and they fed us right away. Very generous hosts. But Jacob and Martha, the two we met first, they're these Inuit who came off the land, and they're probably mid to late 20s in the 1970s. Oh, wow. So they were actually living on the land in skin tents and igloos. And he's still doing it all. He's like still the hard man. He's like mid-70s. He's still like the biggest, toughest Inuk in town.
Wow.
And he doesn't speak English. They just speak Inuktitut because they didn't go into school. They basically came in, and then but everyone else, the extended family does speak Inuktitut. That's like the common language. But right away, he's kind of he just killed a caribou the day before, and it was just raw caribou he had laid out, and he just kind of cut up us off some pieces. We ate like raw caribou, just melted in your mouth.
I had it in Nunavik at one time, and it was quite delicious.
Very
actually.
Good, yeah. And his Martha quickly whipped up some bannock. Then he showed us some of his like fishing lures that are actually made of caribou bone.
Wow.
So they like the flasher was a caribou bone flasher, which he'd used for 40, 50 years.
Amazing.
And it still works to haul in big, huge lake trout, which they were fishing there. So, so right away we're learning some of these kind of the things they eat, and they'd actually had cached a couple of the caribou that they got in the land because they like to let it ferment. They like the meat actually fermented, gets this kind of gamey. It's almost like a Limburger kind of cheese later on in town. They were kind of laughing, kind of having us eat Inuit food. So they would, they catch a char, and they did watch me and Ryan eat an eyeball, and everyone kind of laughed as we kind of chewed this chewy kind of char eyeball. And then they also fed us.
And how was the fermented caribou? What was that? Like?
We didn't get the fermented caribou, but we did get the fermented seal, which is kind of, they had basically literally a bit of new technology, but they basically had this seal that was fermenting in a Rubbermaid tin just for 3 months. And so Jacob basically took a little piece of it, and he wouldn't let us touch it. He said, if you touch this, the smell won't get off your hands for 2 weeks. And so I know
my dog rolled in one a few weeks ago or a few months ago.
Something rotten?
A dead seal, in fact, and it was horrifying.
Exactly. So this is actually something they love. This is like their favorite food. And so he fed us like little birds with his hand as the whole like family. Basically, where we were living is this in his house, and basically they spent a few more days. He just called in some friends. They came in and picked us up by boat. And we did the 170K back with them. We gave Jacob our canoe in exchange.
Quite serendipitous, I have to say.
Yeah. So our canoe, we gave our canoe to him in exchange, he could check his fishing nets and stuff. And then he also let us stay in his house for free.
Amazing.
And he actually kicked out 2 of his nephews so we could stay there because we were guests, and they just went and stayed with their aunties somewhere in town. So he insisted we have our own rooms. But when he came back a couple of days later, so he's feeding us. So the whole family comes when Jacob comes. He's kind of like, the elder with all the respect. And so everyone's kind of laughing. And so he fed me and Ryan this kind of fermented seal, and it tasted probably like Limburger cheese times 10. Very powerful. Not terrible tasting, surprisingly. I thought I would like instantly throw up.
That would be a little nerve-wracking.
But it was just kind of like, and then they of course laughed at our kind of, our reaction. But I remember every time that in the house, like extended family, all generations, from a 1-year-old up all the way up to Jacob, like a 76-year-old. And they're all just, everyone's talking. When Jacob spoke up, it's like, boom, you can hear a pin drop. The entire room just goes silent as he's speaking in a Inuktitut, very slowly making a point, and everyone just kind of turns and listens. He commands that respect. And I think it's because of his time on the land. They have that kind of, hierarchical, patriarchal, matriarch. So him and his wife are kind of like, you could see they are at the apex of the pecking order there, just because of their experience on the land and how much they've taught all their kids. Like their one kid, Marvin, he's in his mid-30s, and he's really taken on to his father's lead and tries to learn everything he can from him. So it's an amazing experience living in this kind of multi-generational household. And that's how they used to live on the land. They used to have these big kind of communal igloo, like they'd have multiple igloos and often a big central igloo, and they would all live together on top of each other, but have a really good time. They love being social and chatting. They even showed us some of the Inuit kind of games where you're kind of throwing these kind of bones and stuff like that. So
it's amazing when you say with Jacob and his authority and his skill. In the article that's in the Spring Explorer, you talk about him as being one of the last likely throwbacks to the ancient singularity that you're talking about, where humankind was in tune with nature. And that's really neat to hear that's so revered, because even growing up now, if you're a younger generation in a remote town in Nunavut, you're still not going to have that same connection. I mean, you're still blessed with modern conveniences. I mean, I've been to a lot of, when I was up in Pond Inlet 2 years ago, and I had LTE cell phone connection up there. It's no big deal, right? So
one thing in Joe Haven, there's no cell service yet either.
Okay,
it's about to come in this year, so that's kind of like they're one of the last communities that don't have the cell service. They have a very rough kind of satellite Wi-Fi or whatever that they kind of use, but and they have cell phones, but it just kind of it doesn't it's kind of just running off some little Wi-Fi system. There's no cell tower or broad communication that they use yet. So, but you said like Jacob, in terms of his experience, like he grew up living very hard life, but learning, because you had to learn how to survive off the land into his 20s. He was surviving very ably and healthy, but also the Inuit are very practical people, and it's like, I have all these skills, and I know how to stock up with my and get a seal for my family, and how to clothe them and feed them. But it's also a constant, and I think any kind of creature is always looking for the easy way to do something. But if the easy way is the only way the entire time, then I think it starts to become you almost need that kind of more challenge and connection. So when he grew up in the land, obviously when you said, hey, you can come into this town, we'll give you a roof over your head, you don't have to travel so nomadically. He still has hunted his entire life. Most of his food is still from the land because that's what makes him feel healthy, rather than kind of the southern bought kind of processed foods. But
Good.
yeah, exactly. So that's why he is. I think because you see a lot of elders that I've talked to, a lot of them over the years on my various trips, and Jake was probably the most healthy, vibrant one I've seen, because a lot of the elders who were brought off the land, they kind of just ended up sitting around and being they kind of remember that. Like I remember this guy Paul Atutuva, who I interviewed in 2009 in Baker Lake, and he was an elder who lived on the land, and I interviewed him for a film I was shooting. And I said, so what's your favorite time of your life? He said, the favorite time of my life was when I was out on the land before I came into Baker Lake. He said they almost kind of coerced him into coming to Baker Lake. There's almost this kind of like strong suggestion, and they would kill their dogs and say, you have to come into the town.
A very dark part of Canadian history is how they did the resettlements around the north that I think still hasn't come up that well publicly.
Yeah, exactly. So he was saying, his favorite time, the reason that he said his favorite time is when he was on the land, with his wife. He said is because they had freedom and they were making their own decisions. Once they came into town, it's almost like they were treated like children, and they no longer had, even though their life was difficult out on their land, it was fully engaging. They were completely dependent on their own, and they were completely free and independent, and they had all these amazing skills, which all then kind of withered away when they're basically, say you have to live here and it's going to be better for you, and people almost forcing their ideology on them. But luckily Jacob never lost, even though he went into town, he still has the practicality of a roof over his head. He's always out on the land. He's always hunting and fishing.
That's amazing.
And teaching. And he has this one amazing story that Marvin, his son, told me, is that just last year they were snowmobiling from Joe Haven all the way to Baker Lake. It's like 800 kilometers or whatever. And their GPS conked out. And Jacob said no problem. And he just kind of guided them in over the land, reading because there's always prevailing wind, so he just read the Sistrugi, the wind drifts, and directed them for like 400 kilometers just reading the wind drifts on the snow in this kind of completely white landscape, and he guided them, boom, right into Baker Lake.
That's truly incredible. I mean, for listeners who haven't, most people haven't been up on the Barren Grounds. I mean, in the winter, to navigate, there would be no frame of reference that most people could pick up, so that would be
no trees,
absolutely incredible.
Exactly. It's just like, just imagine just snow drifts, and you're reading them by their wind direction. You kind of know where you're going based on the prevailing.
Good for him. That would be terrifying. All of a sudden, have that conk out and think, well, I don't know which way's which.
And Marvin, he doesn't know that skill. That's kind of an innate skill. If you're living on the land into your 20s, it's something you're taught from birth, and it's something that it'd be difficult. You'd have to live that life to really be so comfortable to do that, right? It's you can't just take a weekend course and say, okay, I got Sistrugi navigation dialed, right? So
it is truly amazing. A few years ago, I had a similar encounter with the Inuit woman named Susie, and she grew up on the land and now lived in town, but managed to keep all those skills and spend a lot of time out in the land. And seeing her out there was incredible. We went ice fishing one day, and it was this one hole drilled, one lure used. I caught nothing. She went in there and jigged up 3 char. We were doing the same thing as far as I could tell. I just looked, I couldn't believe it. Just something she just had that there was no chance of teaching me. None. And I fish. It's not like it was my first time dropping a line. So I've always been so impressed, but also so interested in hearing the stories about how you have someone who grew up on the land, perhaps raised nomadically even, now lives today and is exposed to, like we were talking about before, iPads, Netflix. I mean, maybe not there, but in a lot of other communities, Netflix and modern technology, ordering things on Amazon, and being one of the few people on the face of the earth that has that ancient singularity and also modern. And I mean, that must be so incredible to be able to bring that knowledge forth and to be able to learn from it like you have is
and with the Inuit, it's interesting. They're probably like, in terms of like, basically they came from more or less a Stone Age existence almost in the 1970s to now be right up to speed with modern technology. They got satellite TVs. They're going to have the internet up there, but they also ride snow machines. They know how to take apart a snow machine engine and put it back. They're actually very adaptable and practical. What they did living and surviving for 25 years was practical. It's all they had at their disposal was the animals and what they're provided. And then but if you're basically introduced to something that's better and easier, you can see how they're not going to go back to that way. No one's going to go back to that way. But I think it's important also at the same time to maintain those skills and teach those skills so you can go back to that way. And I think it's important in this kind of being engaged in life and in the landscape around you. And I think people like Jacob, he is so engaged with what he's doing. You see, he loves being out in the land, and people who learn from him love it too. And I think there's been a disconnect with some of the younger generation. They have the problems with depression and suicide because they've kind of lost that connection to the land and this place they've come from. And it's, there's so much to do and so much adventure to be had in the area, but they just haven't been introduced. It's almost like a lost generation in a way. So,
yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's so important up there. And also on multiple different levels, just like it was